Hello everyone and a very good morning to all of you. Distinguished delegates, speakers and participants from SAARC member states and other regions around the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very thankful to all of you for joining us in this SAARC webinar. My name is SN Javed and I am working as Research Fellow Renewable Energy at SAARC Energy Center. I shall be moderating today's webinar, the aim of which is to highlight Australia's experiences and its initiatives in solar PV technology with the SAARC member states. The webinar shall include best practices, case studies, and provide participants with information on successful policy intervention and large-scale programs and projects implemented in the field of solar PV by Australian government. It is our honor that Mr. Merele Gonatilke, who is the Chairman Governing Board of SAARC Energy Center, has joined us today in this webinar. He is Additional Secretary, Technical Ministry of Power and Renewable Energy, Government of Sri Lanka, and has additional charge of Chief Commissioner, Sri Lanka Scout Association. We are also equally grateful to Mr. Mohammad Naeem Malik, Director, SAARC Energy Center, for joining us. We are very thankful to both of you for taking out time from your busy schedule to attend this event. I am also extremely grateful to our elite panel of speakers such as Dr. Anna Bruce, Dr. Adrian Penau, Damien Netakhan, and Michael Williamson for their enthusiasm and eager willingness to participate in our webinar. Michael shall introduce all the experts in detail before the start of their relevant session. Now, I would like to introduce briefly Mr. Merele Gonatilke. Mr. Merele Gonatilke has graduated from the University of Moratuwa in field of electrical power engineering and started his career as electrical engineering in the Ceylon Electricity Board since 1990. He has served in various positions before taking up the post of Director Technical at the then Ministry of Power and Energy. Subsequently, he was promoted as Additional Secretary in the Ministry of Power and Renewable Energy since July 2015. He has also served as Chairman Lanka Coal Company Private Limited and Director General Sri Lanka Sustainable Authority. Mr. Marle has an MBA degree from the Postgraduate Institute of Management of the University of Sri Jayawardhanapure, a graduate member of the Engineers Australia since 1993, a corporate member of the Institute of Engineers since 1996. He has also obtained a diploma in international relations from the Diplomatic Training Institute in 2010. He is functioned as a member of the Sri Lankan Atomic Energy Authority, member of Sri Lankan Atomic Energy Board, a member of the Sri Lankan Sustainable Energy Authority. He also served as Manager Power Sector Reforms Project for the Ministry of Power and Energy. During his tenure, he was instrumental in many collaborations in the energy sector as the focal point for Sri Lanka among many international, regional and sub-regional groupings such as SAARC, ACD, UNESCAPE, UN and BIMSTEC. He is one of the key figures in making much awaited SAARC Intergovernmental Framework Agreement for Energy Cooperation a reality. He has participated in many intergovernmental meetings representing Sri Lanka at sub-regional, regional and world level. Mr. Gonatilke is a very keen social worker and has been an active scout since 1974, and in recognition to his services to his nation, His Excellency the President has appointed him as the Chief Scout Commissioner since July 2017. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to request him to deliver his opening remarks. Sir, please.
Thank you very much, Chan, for that's very my briefing about my profile. My dear friends, participants, and presenters of the webinar, welcome and a very good morning from Islamabad to you all. I am Merele Gonatilke on behalf of the SAARC Energy Center, Islamabad, Pakistan. Welcome you all to this webinar, which is to share Australian experiences and initiatives in solar PV technology. It is a great honor for me to speak to you on this occasion and over an important technical topic, which is expected to play its role in the future development and prosperity of the people of the SAARC region. First of all, allow me to briefly speak about the important role played by the SAARC Energy Center in the South Asian region. The center, being a regional institute and a technical arm for the SAARC organization on Energy Matters has contributed tremendously through capacity building and regional cooperation for the member states. The center was created with an expectation to translate the energy vision of SAARC leadership into reality. It is to my opinion living up to its promise. I, as a chairman of the governing board, which is equally represented by the energy professionals from all 8 member states, have been supervising and advising the center on its activities. This center started its operations in the year 2008. During last 10 years, the center has emerged as a vibrant and effective SAARC institute, which has played its role in all regional level energy initiatives. The center has carried out about more than 100 plus interventions. The reports of these interventions are available on center's website, free of cost to anyone interested. Today's webinar is an effort of the first of its kind, as we have tried to collaborate with a regional organization such as UNESCAP. We intend to hold few more events on the various aspects of this technology in near future. Your participation in those is solicited. Dear participants, present-day solar PV technology, a low-carbon energy solution, is well suited for South Asian member states. With large areas of the region endowed with bountiful of solar radiation, many countries in the region have the ideal conditions for utilizing solar energy. In South Asia, the development of solar PV technology on a large scale shall provide increased energy security and also less import of fossil fuel and usage of environmentally friendly technologies. Dear participants, lately Australia has witnessed huge success in its solar PV sector due to innovative policies and interventions. Their government was able to overcome barriers to the market integration and uptaking of solar technology. We wish to disseminate their valuable experiences to our SAARC region. Thus, we have invited experts from the Australian academia, industry, and the government to share their success stories with us. I am delighted to acknowledge the great cooperation and support extended by all of them in this regard. In the end, I once again thank you all for joining this webinar and shall request you to feel free in suggesting us any improvement in the working of the center. Today, in the afternoon, we have a special session of knowledge sharing in this regard. I would also extend my special thanks to the presenters of the webinar, as well as to UNESCAP for playing a key role in realizing this event. Lastly, I wish you all a very comfortable learning and knowledge sharing in this webinar. May God bless people of South Asia and give us strength to serve them better. Thank you very much and best of luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for your opening remarks. Dear participants, you will have the opportunity to ask questions to presenters by typing your questions or clicking to the raised hand option into the attendees pane of the main window of GoToWebinar software. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentations. We will collect these and address them during the question answer session at the end of each presentation. Additionally, you will also have a chance to share your views in the knowledge sharing session of the webinar. So now we come to our next agenda point, which is presentation, introduction to the speaker, setting the scene, a brief outline of Australia's PV sector in 2019. It will be delivered by Mr. Michael Williamson, who's the Section Chief Energy Division, UNSK Bangkok. I will briefly introduce Mr. Michael. Michael Williamson is a Section Chief of the Energy Division in UNSK since 2018. Prior to his role, Williamson was the Acting Director of UNSCAPE Sub-Regional Office for South and Southwest Asia, overseeing 10 countries of South and Southwest Asia. He was also the Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to the Executive Secretary of UNSCAPE in Bangkok. He began his UNSCAPE career in New Delhi, India, as the head of the United Nations Asian and Pacific Center for Transfer of Technology. Mr. Williamson's experience over the last 20 years covers private sector, government, and international organizations with a focus on sustainable development, energy, technology, and climate change. Mr. Williamson also worked for Australian government at state and federal level in areas of climate change, sustainability, energy policy, renewable energy support policies, development of the emerging renewable energy sector. In the climate change arena, he worked for Australia's National Climate Change Agency in Canberra, managing commercialization programs funding advanced solar, wind, biomass, and wave power technologies. In this role, he also was the policy manager of a venture capital fund investing in renewable energy startup companies. In between his government roles, he undertook technical and humanitarian assignments with the International Committee of Red Cross. During the 1990s, Williamson gained hand-on experience developing energy projects for remote communities in Nepal. Williamson holds a Master's of Science in Renewable Energy from Loughborough University, UK, and has an honours degree in Civil Engineering from Monash University, Australia. He has completed a postgraduate diploma in management from the Australian Institute of Management and is a graduate of the UN Leadership course at the United Nations Staff College. So I'll now hand it over to Williamson for his speech.
Thank you very much, Asan, and a warm welcome to everybody. So it's a real pleasure to join you on this webinar. I think we have a lot to get through and some very interesting speakers. I don't want to spend too much time and stand between you and the speakers' presentations, but apart from thanking you all, I'd really like to echo my thanks that Asan already extended to the speakers who have donated their time very generously to brief us. And the first speaker, in fact, Mr. Damien Netakan, is under a bit of time pressure. He has to get away pretty soon. So after I finish my introduction, I will pass to Mr. Netakan for his introduction. But first of all, I work for UNSCAP, which is the United Nations Regional Commission covering Asia and the Pacific. It has 54 member states in Asia and the Pacific, and I work in the Energy Division. So it's a real pleasure to have the chance to work with SAARC Energy Center to bring this webinar to you. You're going to hear a lot from the experts on the Australian PV sector, and I really just wanted to emphasize that Australia's PV story started from very humble beginnings. You know, I think I was in the sector 15 years ago and we were rather pessimistic about the future of PV, and it's really encouraging to see how far it's come. And I think it's a lesson for all countries that the future with solar is very achievable, and a lot can be done with the right policy settings. We've seen extraordinary growth in Australia, which has kind of started from the rooftop PV sector and then moved into the medium and now the large scale sector, which is the opposite evolution to what you've seen in Europe and other regions where it started with the large scale. So it's a very interesting case study. And along the way, there have been many policy challenges which have been solved by successive governments along the way. And I think, you know, when we listen to all of these stories, we have to keep in mind that when we are sharing experiences of different countries, we do have to put them in context. It's not as if you can copy one set of policies and transplant them to a different country. We need to look at the much broader principles and strategies. And solar, on the face of it, seems simple. You know, it's a technology that produces electricity from sunlight, but it is a very complex, if we think about what are the environmental dimensions in terms of emissions reduction, pollution, what are the social implications in terms of how we give people in different social classes access to solar, what can it do for networks, what will be the role of storage, and the list goes on. So solar is a very deep and interesting topic, and I hope that the presenters can shed some light on it. So with Asan's permission, perhaps then I can just go to introduce the first speaker, Mr. Damien Netakan. Damien has been working in the sector for many, many years. He's based in Melbourne, Australia. He's a chartered energy engineer with 18 years of experience in renewable energy and energy efficiency. He's worked across all aspects of the development process of both utility scale and behind the meter renewable projects. He's covered wind farms, behind the meter wind turbine projects, solar PV, commercial rooftop, as well as utility scale solar. He's also worked a lot in energy efficiency, doing some very large energy efficiency audits for the manufacturing and food businesses in Australia. He's also played a role in leading some of the major grant funding applications for state and federal government renewable energy and energy efficiency schemes. So I think Damien is very well positioned to give you this overview about how the industry in Australia and the solar accreditation has underpinned a lot of the success that we'll be talking about. So if that's okay, Damien, perhaps we can pass over to you to hear your presentation.
So, Damien, over to you now.
Get the picture as well. Why don't we have picture representation?
Sir,
I'll do it.
Sir Williamson was supposed to just introduce.
Okay. Small speech.
Damien, can you hear us?
Self-muted.
Damien, you have self-muted yourself. Please unmute yourself. We cannot hear your voice. Damien, can you hear us?
Okay, if it stays unmuted, that's going to let me speak to you all. So I trust you can hear me now. Thank you for the opportunity. And I'll be talking about how Australia has used accreditation systems for installation and products to make sure that the solar uptake nationally is done with high quality and good customer outcomes and avoids the pitfalls of quality problems, lack of trust in the products, lack of trust in the installation industry, and consumers slowing down when they're not comfortable to proceed. But with the presence of a strong accreditation system, these sorts of issues are improved, and we've seen a huge uptake in Australia to one of the highest per capita rates of solar PV in the rooftop space globally. So I'll start with an introduction to my company. This is an example of the sorts of people we work for. We're an energy consulting business focusing on solar in Australia, as Michael was saying. And just so the audience has an idea of who I and my colleagues work for, here's some of our key clients, which are local governments, universities and water authorities who are implementing solar at various scales, from rooftop systems to multi-megawatt solar farms. And we provide a sort of technical and project management consultancy service to these types of people. We've also done work in Pakistan, which I'll touch on later, so I have some insights to the market kind of status in the South Asia area. But coming back to Australia, I want to illustrate that we are an example of a company that benefits from these accreditation systems. Here in Australia, we are members of both the Smart Energy Council and the Clean Energy Council. And these are both peak bodies which represent the industry and assist companies like ours to brand ourselves as allied and aligned with the quality standards of these peak bodies. We also employ several engineers who themselves are accredited solar designers, which means that they have qualifications and experience that enables them to hold the title of accredited solar designer. And there's a whole lot of benefits that come with that. And in many cases, it's actually mandatory to have it in Australia as well. So it's really across the board, and that's driven by policy and regulation. But it's also driven by consumer choice and consumer protection. So the next slide I want to talk to is a kind of overview of what I felt is important to convey about how Australia has approached this and how other countries can also approach this. So if our aim is to maximize the successful uptake of solar PV throughout the whole country, then it's very beneficial to have a nationally recognized accreditation system for products and installers. I'd like to acknowledge that in many countries there's very rare or perhaps no equivalent industry accreditation systems because of the state of development of the country is focusing on other priorities. It maybe be seen as a kind of luxury or something that can't be expected yet. And I guess for those who are the sort of ambitious policy makers amongst you, would recommend that you look at putting proposals to parliaments and state and national policy platforms to get some legislation in place which links things like rebates and feed-in tariffs to accreditation systems, which, for example, could mean that the owner of the solar system can only get the feed-in tariff paid to them if they have used an accredited installer to install the solar panels. And otherwise, unless they have that certified installer, they wouldn't be able to benefit from the feed-in tariff. That would immediately massively boost the demand for accreditation. So it will also support the training sector and the trades in the country. So the colleges and the electrical trades associations will benefit from this. And customers benefit because quality assurance and safety is boosted by ensuring that products and tradespeople are both of a high standard. The Clean Energy Council is probably the most broadly active peak body in Australia, and this slide shows their key programs that they have in place. So first of all, there's a membership option. So for companies like my own company who want to be aligned with the association. And then there's an accredited installer program, which is for anybody designing and anybody installing solar and battery storage systems. And because in Australia it is tied to, I guess, rebate type certificates, which every customer wants those certificates, and no customer would really consider having an installation done without those certificates, then they must get an installer who has this accreditation. And then there's also a kind of consumer protection or best practice program called the Approved Solar Retailer. And this, for companies that qualify, it sets them apart from those companies that haven't qualified because they've demonstrated that they've got rigorous ethical and quality standards throughout their organization, which creates much more trust from consumers and generally is policed quite heavily. And applications are rejected at quite a high level. So companies can't expect to get this unless they do meet these high standards. And these sorts of initiatives play a role in Australia's success and achievements. And thanks to the Clean Energy Council who provided that slide for me. This is a graph shows the total number of installers in Australia. So this is the total number of individual tradespeople who have obtained Clean Energy Council accreditation, both for designing and installing. So there's as of 2017, the latest data, there's about 5,000 individuals in Australia, all of whom can be contacted through a directory for the local installation services or local design services. The presentation of these sorts of programs is a strong selling point and a kind of marketing point, both for the peak body and also all the members. Also for the installers, can use it as a marketing material. And this is a screenshot from the Clean Energy Council website. Again, this sort of overview of the outcome of this national program in this country is that there are 600 member companies. Currently, the number has gone up from the 2017 figures to 6,000 accredited installers, 3,000 approved products, and 140 approved solar retailers. So just to touch on the products, those 3,000 products cover solar panels and inverters predominantly are the types of product which have to be on their approved list if they're to be eligible for customers to receive rebates. And it's basically grown in strength to now have the status that most people in Australia would say you just can't install a panel that isn't on that list, or you can't install an inverter on that list. And that's somewhat backed up by regulation. You could argue that large-scale projects that aren't affected directly by the regulations can use other products, but in practice, there's not really any products in this country which aren't on those lists. So the benefits that we see at my company of these existence of these schemes are listed here. So the credibility I've talked about, both of our company and of the products that we can specify. There is recourse against poor installation or poor products being installed. So these schemes can help any of our customers that have had a bad experience of having poor quality equipment installed or good quality equipment installed in a bad way. To have that fixed is much easier by having the backing of this scheme. There's an increased opportunity for corrective work, and my company has a part of our workflow is delivering that corrective inspections and work for our clients. And it's also good for, as I mentioned, minimizing poor quality products and for ensuring continued professional development, both of our staff and of the wider industry. Now, this is a bit broadening out the topic, but I just wanted to give you guys an idea of what we're currently working on as examples. We're working on some larger scale solar farm projects, particularly on former landfill sites, which is a popular option, becoming more popular in Australia because it's a good use of land, and there's a lot of other land which is of good agricultural use, which people prefer not to use for solar, but former landfill sites are available. So we're pretty busy there. And I wanted to just share briefly with you the example of projects we've worked on in Pakistan. This village project was using some equipment which we also use in Australia, but it's international, equipment provided mostly from Chinese manufacturers. And it was, I guess, an illustration, as many of you will know from your own experience with solar power in the South Asian countries and in rural areas, that there is a need for quality. There is a need to avoid incorrect installations so that these systems are reliable and that the lights stay on in these villages for the many years and systems don't degrade. So I wanted to thank you all for your time. Thanks, Michael, for the introduction. And if there's any time for questions, I'm available for a little bit longer. Thank you.
I think we are entering some kind of audio issue with Damien. Maybe we need to check with Michael. Damien, can you hear us now?
Yes.
Your voice is. So okay, so I think it's finished now. Damien's presentation. So Damien, is it okay? Now we should go on to Michael for any question answer sessions.
That sounds fine. So if anybody.
Yes, if there
So
are
Michael,
any
yes, Michael, I have given you the floor. You can
yes,
ask questions.
thank you, Hassan. If there are any questions of Damien, we'd be happy to receive them either by text or by you can just sort of raise your question.
Well, one of the very first question which came to us is from Nepal, and the question asked from Nepal, Mr. Ram Gopal Lagejo, is that this installer program, this accredited program which you have conducted in Australia, what about those commercial buildings in which you install these solar systems and the business model associated with those commercial entities? I'm not talking about the residential communities, specific to those commercial entities where you install these systems, and what is the payback period of those solar systems? This is a little bit off the question from your presentation, but just a query from the Nepalese guy. Could you just be brief in your reply, please?
Okay, the commercial systems in Australia that are below 100 kilowatts in size are covered by all of those accreditation systems, and so it is applicable to commercial systems as well. Payback periods for commercial systems vary, but probably between 5 and 6 years for large commercial systems is what we conservatively calculate at present. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you very much, Damien. So we have a question from Pakistani. This question is that could you just explain what the type of work which you did in Pakistan? I think this participant is specifically referring to the project you mentioned in your slides about the Sindh villages and these remote areas. Could you just explain us about that project? What was the main intention behind this project? What were the donors and what was the outcome of that project, please?
Yes, sure. Well, it was ultimately World Bank funded, and the Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund managed the funding. I was engaged as a consultant to the PPAF, and I worked alongside with the implementation partner, was called Indus Earth Trust, based in Karachi, and have implemented solar mini grids in many villages now. The specific project outcome that I was involved with was the installation of solar and battery mini grids in 4 villages, each of about 100 houses, and we installed around 20 kilowatts of solar and a bunch of batteries in each village and installed AC wiring to all the houses with LED lighting and mobile phone charging. The operation of the mini grids was then handed to the villages, and there was a range of types of installation. One village already had an unofficial Kunda electricity supply, which was then kind of had some issues, teething issues, because the customers tried to use both systems and that didn't work very well. But in some of the villages where they had no previous electricity supply, it worked very well, still working. And instead of using kerosene, now they can have electric lights, which are much better. My details are on my slides. If somebody wants to contact me, I have more slides that I can send about that project later on.
Okay, I'm just turning to Asan. We could hear you very well, Damien. Thank you for the answer. I'm just turning to Asan once more to see if there are any more questions for Damien. Asan, can you hear me okay? Hello, Asan. I'm just checking to see if you have any more questions before we move on to the next segment. Okay, I think we may have lost the connection to Islamabad because I don't see any symbol next to Asan's name. We have you back?
Yes, sorry. There's some kind of a IT issue with us here in this center. So now we are back with our broadcasting. Sorry, gentlemen and ladies, for this inconvenience. So Damien, yes, over to you for this question. I hope you have heard the question. So do I need to repeat it again, or is it okay? You want to reply directly?
Yes, if you could repeat the question, that would be great.
Okay, so the question from this Bangladesh folk, Mr. Mohammad Rabiul Islam, is that how NR developed technical skills of a professional for quality installation and maintenance of a PV solar system? And do your company NR, do they offer any type of a training? And if yes, where are those technical centers established?
Okay, so the question was whether we offer technical training, and if so, where are those established? Is that right?
Yes. And secondly, the question. Yes.
Okay, I'll just answer that part. No, we don't actually provide training ourselves. So our accredited solar engineers have trained, obviously, at university, and then also at colleges that provide that type of accredited training to obtain their certificates. And there's a very large number of training centres in Australia around all the capital cities. So, but we're not a training organisation ourselves. And was there another part to the question?
Yes, the other part was that if yes, then you may tell us about the training institutes. So I guess since you don't do that, so not relevant, right?
No, I mean the issue, like the way forward for a national program would be to enable the existing colleges and electrical qualification, electrical training centres to be themselves approved to deliver the training, which makes the installers accredited. So, the colleges and electrical training centers around the countries could be applied to become training centers for the national program, and then individuals from those parts of the country can attend those courses. So that's the kind of way that it happened in Australia.
Very clear. I think there's some kind of a distortion.
Okay. Well, basically, the way forward would be for the universities and colleges and
Damien, we are not.
I'll put a written answer in the chat, Asan, and maybe you can forward that.
Yes. So, Damien, there is another question from Yusuf Jamal that you have talked about solar panel farms on dumping sites. So, I think he is referring specific to that slide which you have mentioned, and he's asking you a question about the energy gains from that specific project and the environmental problems faced.
Okay. Well, I hope you can hear me. I will try to answer that slowly. Yeah, that each project is normally between 3 and 5 megawatts size capacity, so would generate maybe up to 10 gigawatt hours per year. And the environmental issues are mostly focused on not disturbing the cap, which is above the landfill. So making sure that the environmental monitoring of gas and water can continue uninterrupted. Visually, there usually is a need for consultation with the neighbors who will be able to see the project. But other than that, there's not really any general environmental impacts of these sorts of projects that are too dramatic. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. So thank you very much, Damien, for that very brief reply. So another question is from the Sri Lankan colleague. His name is Mr. Gamini Hera. And his question is that how is the stability and power quality issues caused by solar PV, how are they addressed? I don't know if this is quite a off the topic question, but if you want to respond, you can, please.
Yeah, it's not my main area of expertise, but power stability in Australia is being met in relation to solar by a couple of ways. Australian standards get tighter and tighter for inverters to be able to assist power quality rather than hinder it. Something else that's happening at the large scale is the large batteries in Australia are now assisting frequency control of the entire network, which is improving the reliability for a lot of customers. So I probably don't have a lot more of technical information I can add. I hope that gives you a bit of an answer.
Thank you, Michael. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Damien. So, Damien, my question to you would be that you have talked a lot about these accreditation schemes regarding the installers and the retailers side. What about those solar panels which are being imported in Australia? How does Australia keep in track the standardization and the labeling of those solar panels and make sure that faulty panels are below the grade panels are not imported inside Australia, because this is being a very big issue in our Pakistan market. Just to
well, I should start by saying the scheme here has not been completely successful. So there has been and there still is problems with low quality products coming into the country. But I think those problems have been minimized by the system which is in place, which means that if I want to import a new brand of Chinese manufactured panels or panels manufactured in India or any country into Australia and sell them as approved products, I must provide independent test certificates from laboratories which have tested samples of my products to the relevant Australian and international standards. So those certificates must be shown from only a small handful of international testing and certification companies which are qualified to do it. And I have to pay quite a lot of money to get those tests done and provide those certificates to the Clean Energy Council before they will allow my product to be approved on their list. So that's the first line of defense. And then there is more levels. The Smart Energy Council have a additional scheme, which is an optional scheme called Positive Quality. And I'll provide some links for that in my slides. So that goes a step further, where additional inspectors are sent to the factories in whichever country is manufacturing it, and provides a more rigorous inspection regime, because of the problem of the manufacturer may provide some good quality products to send to the laboratory, but then afterwards manufacture some poor quality products with the same name and sell them. And so that can't, it's not being fully prevented, but I think it's being mitigated probably to a large extent. And I know about the quality problems in Pakistan, so I mean that would be a good place to start. I hope that gives some answer to the question.
Yes, thank you very much, Damien. So another question from the participant SAARC Mughal is that in Pakistan we are trying to move towards larger renewable penetration via promoting this indigenous technology. So what sort of policy decisions might be required to promote this type of injection of renewable energy?
Well, I think that's a good segue to the next speakers, Hassan, because there's going to be speakers covering a bit in depth on policy. So if that's okay, I'll park that question, and I'm sure there's going to be some good answers found in the next presentations. And I probably also need to sign off because I've reached my time to go to my next meeting.
Sure, Damien, thank you very much for being with us. And over to Michael for yes.
Sure. Thank you, Hassan, and a big thanks to Damien for sparing his time as a private sector person. He's very busy and a lot of clients to look after, so we do appreciate his contribution, and it was really great to get those insights from him. I just wanted to follow up very briefly on one question which came from Sri Lanka about power quality, and I think this is an important issue, and it's one where Australian regulators and policymakers and industry and equipment people have been learning a lot over the years. As you get a lot of PV on the system, you get some unintended consequences. So I think in response to some of these consequences, the Australian standards on inverters have been getting better and better over the years. One of the typical problems is that although inverters, the switch mode inverters produce a very pure sine wave, what does happen is you tend to get some high voltage in some parts of the network. So typically on an Australian street, you might have anywhere up to, a half or 2/3 of the houses have PV systems on their roof, and they're all sitting on the same distribution line. So what you get is elevated voltage. And so the network operators have to work hard to make sure that the voltage doesn't go outside the code limits. From my own experience in my house in Melbourne, my inverter kept tripping off, and when I got the company out, they told me that the voltage in the street was something like 260 volts, and part of that was probably due to PV systems. But I'm sure Adrian or Anna have got some very good hands-on experience they can relate about power quality and solar. So if it's okay with you, Hassan, maybe I can swing into the next section to introduce the next presenter. So the next presenter is Dr. Anna Bruce. She's a senior lecturer at the School of Photovoltaic and Renewable Energy Engineering in the University of New South Wales. And you know, Anna is very well known because if you go to Google Scholar and you type in solar, you'll come up with lots of Anna Bruce papers, because she's a very prolific researcher, and she and her colleagues at University of New South Wales have spearheaded a lot of the work on solar energy. So although it's a young industry, she's kind of grown up from the origins. So Anna is a senior lecturer there at the School of PV and Renewable Energy Engineering, and she's the Engineering Research Coordinator in the UNSW Centre for Energy and Environmental Markets. Her expertise is around sustainable energy transitions, but she also brings an interdisciplinary perspective, including energy policy, markets and regulation, together with renewable energy system analysis, modelling and mapping, and renewable energy integration. So quite a wide range of topics beyond solar. She leads the Australian PV Institute's Australian solar mapping activities, and some of her current research work includes energy data for smart decision making through the Australian Government's Smart Cities and Suburbs programs, and also integrated smart home energy management technologies. She serves as a national expert on the IEA's PVPS programs, and she works on Task 13, which is PV performance and reliability, as well as Task 14, which is about high penetration PV and electricity networks. So that last question from Sri Lanka about how does PV affect the grid, she probably has a bit to tell us on that. And she regularly contributes submissions to state and federal government policy processes relevant to clean energy. So given all that, I'd like to invite Anna to give us her presentation. So it's over to you, Anna.
Anna, now you can go on with your presentation, please. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I'm just getting my screen to show. Great. Can you see my screen now?
Perfect, perfect. Please go ahead.
Right. Okay, thank you very much for that very nice introduction, Michael. What I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to give you a bit of the story of PV policy in Australia. So there's quite a lot in here. So I guess I'll move through it fairly quickly and then leave time for you guys to ask the questions that are of most interest at the end. So I just wanted to say something at the beginning about the very first grid-connected PV system in Australia, which was at Little Bay, actually part a sort of sub-campus of UNSW. So back in 1994, some of my colleagues were involved in getting this PV system, which was a 3 kilowatt PV system, installed and connected to the grid. So I guess 1994 isn't really that long ago, but back in those days, there were some really huge challenges just in terms of getting the approval for the grid connection. And also the PV system had to be registered in the same way that a large coal generator needed to be registered. There was no systems in place to facilitate the connection of this system, and subsequently, following on from that system being installed, in a couple of years later, some of my colleagues at UNSW were involved in developing the first guidelines for grid connection of PV systems, which later turned into standards, and also worked to get an exemption for small generators so they didn't have to go through all of that process. So we have certainly come a long way in Australia. And so I'll now talk a little bit about some of the policies that have got us where we are today. So this is a diagram that I've kind of adapted from an IEA framework, talking about policies at different points in the technology life cycle to support renewable energy. So in Australia, we have policies that apply all across the technology lifecycle from R&D to market maturity. So we have, in addition to our standard R&D funding opportunities that universities can access through the Australian Research Council and our National Research Lab, the CSIRO, we have a specific renewable energy R&D agency called ARENA. And we have had, since about 2012, we've had demonstration programs through solar flagships, and so ARENA was started in about 2012 as well, and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which also provides financing to help private investors to invest in deploying renewable energy. And then in terms of deployment policies, we've had green power schemes which have allowed consumers to purchase electricity with a high percentage of renewable energy through a certificate scheme. And then we've had a range of, we had a renewable energy target scheme, which I'm going to talk about in a bit of detail. That's a green certificate scheme. And that policy, combined with our feed-in tariffs, is what has really driven our PV market, starting with the small scale and now more recently state auctions in combination with the renewable energy target scheme, driving more commercial and utility scale policies there. So I'm going to talk a bit about just these policies here, which are now driving the R&D and commercialisation, and also this group of policies up here, which are driving deployment of PV. So first I'm going to talk about the renewable energy target, which is Australia's main policy for supporting the deployment of renewable energy. So the target involves, it started off being an additional 2% of renewable energy, but it has since been revised and now targets over 20% of Australia's renewable energy to come, electricity to come from renewable energy. So Australia's starting from a fairly low base compared to a lot of countries, with a really high percentage of our electricity, more than 90%, coming from coal, around 90%. So this renewable energy target policy has been the main driver. So it's a certificate scheme, and so how it operates is that renewable energy generators generate certificates for every megawatt hour of electricity that they generate, and liable entities, which are the electricity retailers, need to purchase enough certificates to meet a certain percentage of the electricity that they sell in each year. And so initially, the renewable energy target scheme was completely technology neutral, and all technologies were equally, the certificates were worth the same regardless of the technology that generated the certificates. And it was expected that there would be a lot of certificates generated by technologies like burning of waste from sugarcane farming, bagasse, so biomass generation, because that was seen to be the cheapest technology at the time. What turned out to happen was a little bit different. In fact, the wind was proved to be one of the cheapest technologies, and also small-scale PV, which received other forms of support, became very popular and started to take up a lot of this target as well. So just so prior to the renewable energy target, we had a rebate scheme. The renewable energy target came into play in around 2009 to replace this rebate scheme. Because the rebate scheme was rather generous, it was about $8 a watt, the renewable energy, the small scale PV systems were eligible to generate 5 certificates for every unit of electricity instead of 1. And so that meant that it drove a high uptake of household PV systems, because that rebate, as the prices of PV fell very rapidly, and at the same time state governments introduced feed-in tariffs to support small-scale PV, we ended up having really short payback times for households installing PV systems, so that became very popular. The market really boomed. And so we had the ramping down of these multipliers in the Renewable Energy Target Scheme and the removal of the feed-in tariffs, the state feed-in tariffs, all happening in quite a short period of time. So we ended up having this boom-bust kind of cycle in the industry, which was actually quite challenging for the industry, because people were being employed really rapidly and perhaps inadequately trained up, and then jobs were lost when the installations dried up, and this is quite challenging for the industry. But so what we're looking at here between 2010 and 2014, this is largely small-scale rooftop PV systems being installed mainly on households. Okay, so essentially the feed-in tariffs had a big impact on this market in particular. So I guess one of the things with the feed-in tariffs that we had in Australia is that they were quite generous. So state governments were very keen to capitalise on the popularity of PV systems amongst households, and so we saw some very generous feed-in tariffs. So 60 cents a kilowatt hour in New South Wales. And now, at the time when the scheme was designed, it was actually a reasonable subsidy to be providing, but because the price of the PV systems were coming down really rapidly, as we saw a lot of deployment in Australia, very quickly that became really too generous, that feed-in tariff. And so that's part of the reason why we had this really big boom. And I guess this is one of the challenges with feed-in tariffs. It's really hard, it's quite challenging to get the price right. And if the price is a little bit too high, you tend to get a boom. And if it's a bit low, then it doesn't have a lot of impact in terms of promoting the uptake. So I think in designing feed-in tariff programs, it's really important to be monitoring what's happening, and to design the policy in a way that it is somehow flexible, so that the feed-in tariffs can be adjusted. And so the case of Germany, for instance, implemented feed-in tariffs in this kind of way, where they can be more easily adjusted. They had but without creating uncertainty for the industry, because there was a scheduled periodic reassessment of the value of the feed-in tariffs. But nevertheless, despite this boom bust that we saw with the feed-in tariffs and the generous multipliers with the renewable energy target, we did see these policies really driving down the price of PV as the industry gained experience with this technology. So in that respect, that was a successful policy. However, because of the small PV systems taking up a large amount of the target, there in 2012 there was the policy was revisited, and there was a separation. The small scale solar PV systems below 100 kilowatts were separated out in the scheme from the large scale PV systems and other renewable generators greater than 100 kilowatts, in order to ensure that there was still value in the certificates being generated by the larger scale systems. So I just want to talk a little bit about now what's happened in Australia with small scale or rooftop PV, because Australia is a really world-leading example of distributed PV, and we have in 2 of the states in Australia, more than 30% of households have a rooftop PV system. So we do have a lot of really small PV systems out there. And so from that time when we had those generous feed-in tariffs, very quickly those feed-in tariffs were removed, and now we have a situation where if you have a PV in the distribution network and you're exporting, you receive a price which is really closer to the wholesale price, and much so, you know, maybe around 8 cents a kilowatt hour, much less than the retail price that residential customers would be paying, which might be around 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Despite that, it's still rooftop PV is still a really good investment. So we still have some support for rooftop PV through the renewable energy target. So for instance, a 4 kilowatt PV system, which is quite a popular size, would be maybe $6,500, and you would get about $2,000 from of certificates for that. But the paybacks that we're talking about, like 3 to 5 year paybacks for households installing PV systems. So really good paybacks there. So now we have this conversation about households that are installing PV systems and therefore reducing their electricity bills, but the networks still needing to be paid for. And so there's a concern that's arisen about PV customers being cross-subsidised by other customers who are still continuing to pay their bills at the same level. So this chart is showing some analysis by the networks about their concern that even though PV does provide benefits in the distribution network by reducing peak demand and in the transmission network, that still it is less benefit than the amount that people can reduce their bills by. So this has been a big discussion in Australia, and it's really highlighted, I guess, the cross subsidies that exist in the system in general. So there's been quite a bit of analysis out there showing that, and it's widely acknowledged that customers that use air conditioners or very peaky loads are actually being cross-subsidised even more than PV customers. And we have a range of other cross-subsidies there too, particularly supporting customers that are in more rural areas that are more expensive to serve. So this is a conversation which is, started around PV, but we're now, it's also really relevant to other distributed energy technologies that we're starting to see more capabilities for, including battery storage and demand response. These technologies, which can be really valuable in managing energy in the distribution network and reducing costs, but we do need to rethink the business models of the utilities and the design of tariffs. So I guess this is a upcoming challenge that we have. So yeah, questions about how much PV owners should pay to use the network, or how much what the feed-in tariff should be. And we've had a range of utility proposals to try to limit how much PV is going in, like introducing hosting limits, increasing the fixed charges, so the cents per day charges, so that to reduce the amount that people can reduce their bills by using distributed energy. So that's, you know, some of the ways that utilities have tried to initially reduce the amount of the impact that PV is having on their business models. But we are now starting to see a wide acknowledgement by the utilities, the network businesses, that we are undergoing a transformation in our energy system, and we are going to see a lot of distributed energy resources, and they're now starting to look at ways that they can really take advantage of those technologies rather than blocking them. So we've also had some progress in terms of our feed-in tariffs as well. So I just show you a recent development in Victoria, one of the states. We've now had a feed-in tariff that's actually a time-varying feed-in tariff, which better reflects the value of energy at different times of the day. And so this incentivises customers, for instance, to put in storage in order to take advantage of the peak time, which is typically in the evening in a residential area, by shifting their exports using batteries or potentially other technologies like demand response. So tariff design is shaping up to be an important aspect of our energy transition in Australia, because we do have such high levels of distributed PV, and now we're starting to see a lot of storage going in as well, in the battery storage being put in by households and small businesses. So here we can see over time what's happened in terms of installed capacity of PV in the residential market. So here the blue section, the residential section, is PV systems less than 10 kilowatts in size. And then the slower growth in the commercial market, the orange segment there. And then really it's only just recently that we've started to really see utility scale PV taking off in Australia, behind what was happening in other countries at the time. So we're going to have a look at what happened and what sorts of policy approaches we used in Australia. Sorry, so this is just a map as well, just to highlight some of the areas in Australia where we have really high penetrations of PV. So we're looking here at local government areas and the percentage of households that have a PV system in these different areas. So you can see there's quite a large number of areas where more than 40% of the households in the area have a PV system. And also, all of this PV is having an impact on the profile that is being, the load profile that's being seen by the market operator as well. So here, this chart here is showing in the darker colours, is in each of the states is the load profile. And then on the top there, you can see what the load profile would have been if we didn't have the distributed PV. So all of that pale section at the top is the impact on the load profile just from distributed PV. This doesn't include any utility scale PV, which we now have growing amount of utility PV. It's just the residential and PV and the PV on commercial buildings here. So you can see that it's really hollowing out the middle of the day there, and we do see on many days that it actually reduces the morning and the evening peak and tends to push the peak later in the day, and certainly reduces areas, any peaks that would have occurred in the middle of the day there. I guess I started by looking at different policies at different parts of the technology life cycle. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the policies that we've had to support the demonstration and the commercialisation of the large-scale PV systems in particular. So where there was certainly some challenges making those investments attractive in the market. So we had some demonstration programs to really kind of prove up those technologies and reduce some of those early mover costs for some of the other projects that came through later. And then we've also had a range of, had Clean Energy Finance Corporation providing support for financing, as well as we do have our Renewable Energy Target Scheme, which is there to support commercialisation deployment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Renewable Energy Target and some of our demonstration programs, starting with solar flagships and then grants provided through the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and the financing support. And I'll just touch a little bit on the state government reverse auctions that we've now started to see, because I think Adrian's going to go into that probably in some depth. So yeah, starting off talking about the renewable energy target. So what we've found is with the RET, our experience has been that the RET has the design of this type of scheme, a green certificate scheme or renewable portfolio scheme, if you like, which has been quite popular in the US, but not used much in European countries, which have tended to use feed-in tariffs, is that it, without any banding, you do tend to just get a lot of investment in whatever the cheapest technology is. And one of the key challenges, I think, with this type of scheme is that you do end up, you've got a fixed demand for certificates, which is set by the policymaker. And so you do tend to, depending on how much supply there is, you tend to get a really high price or a really low price for certificates. So we have seen a lot of price volatility in this renewable energy target scheme, which is really challenging for renewable energy because most of the cost for wind and solar are capital costs, and so rather than operational costs. And so the cost of financing is really significant around, and the financing cost can be around 30% of the cost of a renewable energy project. So the uncertainty around the revenue is a really significant challenge in this type of scheme. Another thing about this kind of scheme is that because you have a small number of buyers, so in this case it's the retailers, which are only a handful of large retailers serving most of the customers in Australia. These retailers have a lot of market power, and they also essentially the renewable energy generators need, in order to get their project up, they need to sell their energy and they need a buyer for their renewable energy certificates. And the retailers are the buyers of the energy and the renewable energy certificates, and they also own other types of generators. So there's been challenges in really for renewable energy generators to actually get any retailers to sign up to power purchase agreements to purchase their energy or their green certificates that they created through the Renewable Energy Target Scheme. So yeah, I'll just skip through that. But yeah, so this is what I was just talking about. The renewable energy developer can either develop their plant without a power purchase agreement, which is obviously risky and involves more expensive financing, or mostly they need to have a power purchase agreement before they can go ahead with developing their project. So yeah, the value of the renewable energy certificates are really important for managing the uncertainty, and as is signing up to a power purchase agreement. Yeah, so essentially what happened in Australia is that our renewable energy target wasn't really driving much uptake of large-scale renewable energy, even when the small scale was isolated and separated out and there was a separate target for the large-scale renewables to meet. It was still not much being built, and you know, they were unable to get the power purchase agreement signed, and the price of the certificates was going up, but still, you know, nothing was happening, and the price of the certificates really started to go up close to the penalty price in the scheme, and still nothing was being built. So I guess I want to talk a bit about some of the things that were happening in parallel to the Renewable Energy Target Scheme that were, you know, started to kickstart our utility scale solar build. So we had a program called Solar Flagships, and it was started around 2012, and it was essentially to demonstrate utility scale solar in Australia. And it needed $3 of private investment to match every dollar of public money. But again, so it was a really ambitious scheme, and in particular, the government wanted to fund some very large scale, tens of megawatts of PV, or even 100 megawatts of PV and similar amount of solar thermal, but we'd never had any experience in Australia of building any utility PV at that scale. So it was really probably too ambitious and risky, and the proponents found it really difficult to get financing that they needed, and they were having trouble, as I mentioned, getting the retailers to sign up to power purchase agreements. So essentially, there was projects which were awarded, which won this solar flagships scheme, but they were never built because they couldn't get the financing required. And so it was quite, you know, negative publicity for these technologies, and somewhat damaged the public perception of the solar utility scale solar at that time. But eventually some smaller projects did get built, including actually by the retailers that own the ones that were not willing to sign up to PPAs ended up building their own projects. And so those projects did eventually go ahead. And I guess in the end, even though these demonstration programs do have their challenges, I think they did actually highlight some of the regulatory and market issues, some of the problems that we had, and therefore did reduce the risk for future projects. And I think one of the other learnings was that there needs to be some flexibility around the milestones so that projects can still succeed even though things go wrong and they can't, for example, get their financing in time to meet particular milestones. So we also have a scheme that started around the same time, around 2012, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which was put in place in recognition of the challenges that renewable energy projects were having in accessing appropriate financing. So because there wasn't a lot of experience with renewable energy projects, the financing was costly. Also, the financing available wasn't over the right kinds of timeframes that were required for these kinds of projects. So that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation was put in place to provide this kind of long-term, competitively priced financing for renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. So I'll just mention a couple of other things that have started to turn things around for us in Australia. So Adrian's probably going to talk more about this, but one of the things that's happened is that in addition to the challenges that I've already mentioned around the renewable energy target with projects having challenges getting power purchase agreements signed, there was also a period of a few years where the government was wanting to repeal the legislation for the renewable energy target. And so this created a really significant policy uncertainty because this revenue from these renewable energy certificates was really important for these projects to get financing and to secure PPAs and to go ahead. And so during this period of time, there was the state governments that really wanted to see renewable energy deployed started to step in and introduce their own policies, starting with the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory. So they introduced a target and then also a renewable energy reverse auction scheme to meet that target. Similar schemes have then been now implemented in Victoria and are soon to be also implemented in Queensland. So that also started to kickstart the build of utility scale PV in Australia. And so you can see there, looking at the state targets, that they actually exceed the generation from the renewable energy target scheme. And so what we've seen is we have started to see the utility solar starting to be built, which you could see those grey sections in that earlier slide. We're really now, and this year we've had a huge boom in 2018 with utility scale solar, and there's a really large pipeline of projects that have started to be built or have committed financing locked in. So you can see here what has happened, starting with those flagships programs. The first yellow bar there is the estimates from the Bureau of Resource and Energy Economics, the government estimates of what the cost of utility scale solar is per megawatt hour. And then you can see there the ACT, it says FIT, but it's actually the reverse auction scheme with a agreed purchase price there, really starting to bring down the price. And then ARENA stepping in and also working with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to help finance some more of this utility scale solar. And we're now starting to see through the Victorian auctions which are taking place, anecdotally, we're now seeing $50 a megawatt hour prices for renewable energy through that scheme. So these renewable energy reverse auctions and other support from grants and finance from ARENA and finance support from Clean Energy Finance Corporation have really driven down these prices. And one of the things, the important things, sorry, I'll just show you a little bit now the pipeline. You can see there since 2016 to 2019. So at the beginning of 2016, there being some concern about meeting the renewable energy target, despite the certificates being right up at the penalty price, the ceiling price of the scheme, that we're now, the capacity required is maybe 7,000 megawatts at the beginning of 2016, and we now already have accredited and committed projects that already exceed that amount, so which would bring us to more than 20% renewable electricity in Australia. So I guess I wanted to just highlight one of the key things about these auction schemes, which has made them so popular around the world. They're now the leading, the most popular policy around the world for supporting renewable energy deployment. And around the world, they've been driving down the prices and the cost of building renewable energy, and that is largely because these schemes provide a guaranteed price for all the energy generated from the renewable energy plant, which provides a great deal of certainty for the developer and for the financier, and so it drastically reduces the cost of financing, which is really the key to the success of this type of policy. But in this slide here, I was just highlighting one of the interesting things about this kind of scheme compared to something like the renewable energy target is because the renewable energy owner, the plant owner, is receiving a guaranteed price, and they're not exposed to the prices in the electricity market. There's not really an incentive to install the renewable energy generator in the location where that energy is worth the most money. So temporarily or spatially, there's no incentive for the renewable energy generator to go in a place where it's worth more money. So what we've seen is a lot of wind farms going in South Australia, for instance, where there's already a lot of wind farms, and so they tend to generate electricity at the same time, and so therefore at those times that electricity isn't worth much money. So that's just one thing. I still think on balance these auction schemes are working really well and playing a really important role, but the renewable energy target, one of the great things about that scheme is that the developer is still exposed to the value of the energy in the market, so there is an incentive there for them to be concerned about that when they're selecting a location and developing their plant. And so just other things that have been really supporting the large-scale builds in Australia, the corporate sector has really started to step in. We've seen very high prices for electricity in Australia in recent years for a range of different reasons around gas prices, market power, and a range of different issues, but it has meant that there's been a lot of interest as the price of these renewables projects, particularly PV's price has been coming down really rapidly. We're now starting to see corporates signing up to power purchase agreements. So we've got the state government auctions and the corporate PPAs really supporting the deployment of large-scale renewables in Australia. And also we're starting to see some buyers groups as well, which allows smaller businesses as well as large energy users to sign up to these PPAs as part of a group. And you'll see there in 2018, one of the PPAs that was signed in last year was the University of New South Wales, which has signed up to a PPA which covers 100% of our electricity consumption from a solar farm. So yeah, just a slide that leads on to Adrian's presentation, I think, just highlighting the importance of the states and also local governments in helping to drive the uptake of renewable energy in Australia at a time when the federal government was not driving policy as much as it could have been. And just finally, I think this is my last point here, that we're now looking at really projected really low costs of electricity generated by utility scale renewables, particularly, as I said, the cost of solar has really PV's been coming down really fast and is projected to continue falling. And we're already past the point where renewables are cheaper than new build coal in Australia, but we're now at the point where it's actually cheaper than existing coal generation as well per megawatt hour. So we're expecting to see really rapid uptake of renewables in Australia, including distributed PV and also other distributed capacity from distributed battery storage, and also increasingly the confidence is growing that we're going to see a really rapid uptake of utility scale PV and wind in all states in Australia. And you can see in the chart on the right there the renewables replacing the existing coal capacity, and that chart's coming from the planning process that the Australian Energy Market Operator is conducting. So really strong expectations for future renewables growth in Australia, coming from a place where there was concern that we were going to meet our renewable energy target only a few years ago. So I think I'll just finish up there, but I guess maybe to finish, I'll just highlight some of the challenges that we're now facing as we're looking down the barrel of really high distributed energy, including PV and batteries in the distribution network. So there's going to be some challenges that were already raised in terms of managing that and what sorts of business models we might see or regulatory arrangements to manage that. We're also going to see a lot of variable renewable energy, wind and PV in the national electricity market at the system level, and so there's now quite a focus on how we can provide the required flexibility, whether it's through battery storage or pumped hydro or increasing the capacity in the transmission system. This is really where the focus is now. We're kind of at the point now where the transition's happening, but we're really rapidly having to reform the energy market and work out ways to drive this investment in these complementary technologies to provide the flexibility. So I think I'll just finish up there, and if we have time, I can take some questions.
Thank you very much, Anna. It was wonderful listening to you. A very, very informative and detailed presentation. I think there were a lot of material in it, and we were quite happy to hear from you those aspects of the solar PV technology. So, Anna, my the first question which have arrived to us is from Mr. Roy Chaudhary from India, and he has asked a question that do you have a map of tariffs across Australia? He is interested in understanding the impact of solar PV on electricity tariffs. How has it impacted the market and how have these tariffs reduced on the consumer's level?
Okay, so so I guess what's happened is that there was a recognition that we needed to provide more cost-reflective tariffs in order to, and really this is partly driven by the fact that we had really high uptake of air conditioning in Australia, which created very peaky load profiles, which meant that there was a really high level of investment in networks, which increased rapidly the bills of consumers. And so partly there was that concern, but at the same time we started to see technologies like including PV, but also batteries and emerging technologies that would allow consumers to do things on the demand side, which would be able to help to address this peakiness, so to move this peak load to other times of the day. So there was a recognition that we needed to have tariffs that could actually incentivize consumers to use the network more efficiently. And so there's now a process whereby every distribution network is now increasingly, when they have to propose their tariff structures to the Australian Energy Regulator, and they're now assessed. There's a new rule which requires their tariffs to be cost reflective. So you can see the different tariff structures that are being proposed in different areas. I don't actually have a map of that, but certainly what they're starting to move towards is the more cost-reflective tariffs. One of the problems that we do have, however, is that the retailers, which are actually interfacing with the customers, pass on the network tariffs, and there's no requirement for them to pass on this price signal.
So thank you very much, Anna. So now another question from one of my colleagues is that what are the general impacts of this rooftop solar on the distribution grid? He's specifically questioning is because in Pakistan there's a perception that the distribution network is most of the time underutilized, and the PV system should maybe pay for that underutilization of that distribution grid. I think do you understand my point?
Yeah, so I guess the same question about this idea of maybe cross subsidies that I was talking about. So I guess that's a financial rather than a technical impact or an economic impact on the network businesses. So you know, the way that they collect their revenue needs to be addressed. But yeah, so I think I'll just talk about that and then maybe talk a little bit about the technical impacts. But essentially, I think we're starting to see what the network businesses would really like to do is increase their fixed charges. So there's cents per day charges to reduce the amount that consumers can decrease their bills by using distributed energy, but the regulator is really pushing back against this because they're wanting to act in the interests of consumers, and one of the things that they want to see is pricing that is in the long term drives efficient investment. So or so drives consumers to use their loads at times so that we don't need to keep on building more and more network capacity. And even, I guess one thing that we're seeing in Australia is that we actually did get a lot of excess network capacity built in certain parts of Australia, but we're now seeing predictions of really strong uptake of EVs in the distribution network as well. So we are now expecting to probably see some load growth as well. So it is important that we contain the peak load growth so that we can avoid making unnecessary investments. So this is why rather than just charging customers a fixed fee, it's important that they see a price signal around the time of use of their energy consumption. But yeah, so I guess one of the things that we need to rethink is the way that perhaps we regulate network businesses and the way that they collect their revenue and therefore the incentives that they see. And so we have some privately owned and some state-owned networks in Australia, but they're all regulated in the same way. And there has been perhaps too much incentive for them to invest in infrastructure in order to increase their regulated asset base and therefore their returns. So this is something that we need to address. But on the technical side, I just wanted to mention that certainly the PV systems do increase the voltages in the distribution network. But what happened in Australia is, a couple of things. One is that there was a process of decreasing the voltage from 240 to 230 volts, which required networks to make adjustments for that. But also that because of the really high uptake of air conditioners and the really peaky loads at certain times of the day, that creates really low voltages. So there was a tendency for networks to set their voltages really high at the substation to avoid having really low voltages for the customers at the end of the feeders. So now we're starting to see PV coming in, and sometimes in some parts of the network, really, in the end, the impact that the air conditioners have on the voltages is much, much larger than the impact that the PV systems have on the voltages. But with the already high voltages, there's not much of a window for the PV to operate within. There isn't much voltage spare up voltage above the substation for the PV.
Well, thank you very much. I think there is also an associated question to it. Normally in Pakistan also and in South Asian markets, we don't have those very strong or you'll call it reliable kind of distribution networks here. So if there is some kind of a power fluctuation on part of generation or transmission line, so it happens that there's a blackout of the power. So utilities are very careful not to come into such a kind of a position. So they are sometimes very afraid to increase the penetration of PV on these distribution network out of a fear that this might be affecting their own networks. So Mr. Rabiul Islam also asked the same question, that why are the DNPs limiting hosting the PV capacity, and do you think it's a constraint for the DNPs, this increase of renewable energy in their distribution network? I think you have already covered out most of the part of this question. Just from the technical aspect, if there is any, you think there is any problems as far as the utility is concerned. And second part of the question, he's referring to news about the South Australians blackout due to wind farms. I don't know about which news he's referring to. If you have a comment, you can comment on that.
Okay, so I guess essentially the reason why the networks have been trying to introduce these have been introducing hosting limits in certain areas is really just around voltage. So what you're talking about is probably more issues around, so when, blackouts, for instance, what happened in South Australia was there was a loss of a major piece of equipment. So some transmission towers were blown over in really strong wind. So there was a system security event, so a really huge fluctuations in voltage and frequency occurred in different parts of the network. And there was a whole range of factors that actually contributed to that blackout. So I think if you look at the reports from the energy market operator, it's pretty clear that it wasn't caused by the wind farms, and there was a whole range of issues. The loss of the main interconnector with Victoria due to it being overloaded. There was some gas generators that failed to come online to provide spinning reserve, and there was some settings in some of the wind farms which meant that they disconnected to protect themselves, but it was later recognised that they could have been set up differently to actually ride through for longer, and then to provide more assistance to the power system during that event. So these changes have already been made to wind farms in other countries, including in Europe, these ride-through provisions, and it's since been recognised that the energy market operator probably should have required for those wind farms to have those ride-through provisions. But I guess essentially there's some the challenges are more significant for managing the voltage when you do have a long stringy feeders, so in more remote areas. And certainly we have in Australia quite a lot of experience of PV hybrid, PV on hybrid mini grids in remote areas as well, and that there's certainly some more challenges in managing the variability in those small power systems where you have a lot less diversity in the supply options. And yeah, so but that's I think a different situation, and but it's also one where there's a huge value in using renewable energy to really reduce the costs in those remote areas where you do tend to have really expensive diesel generators operating.
Well, thank you very much. And to just add up a little bit, in Pakistan, we have been in the process of approving the policy. I've heard that the policy is already approved that for importing the electric vehicles, the duties and taxes have been removed. So people here have the opinion that with the induction of these electric vehicles into the market, there might be a little bit overload on the distribution networks also because of recharging of those electric vehicles. Just a very small comment from your side. Do you have any study or do you have any experience in the Australian market regarding these electric vehicles charging?
So we don't have much very high penetration of electric vehicles right now in Australia. We've actually probably been lagging a bit in that respect, but there's certainly been research done looking at the impact of uncontrolled EV charging, and comparing that with the load profile where charging is more optimized. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities there to actually think about those batteries as a resource, both as a demand response resource, really by shifting the charging load around, and also, maybe potentially in the future, depending on what consumers want, if they're willing to offer it, but potentially vehicle to grid services as well, whether it's delivering energy or other network services.
Yes, I think that's a very relevant answer. We have been asked two, three participants have asked us about the question that what should be the specific policy as far as Pakistan is concerned, how to increase the deployment of renewables as far as key policies are concerned. So they're asking you about the specific policy. To my understanding, it all depends on the maturity of the power sector, and each country has its own dynamics, its own issues, its own level of its maturity. So you can't pinpoint any specific policy to a specific country. So if you can put in your comments on that one.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that. I think certainly that you know, in the beginning in Australia with the utility scale renewables, we did need that. We had problems with our demonstration and grants programs, but we really did need that learning to bring down the price in the beginning. But I would say that at this point in time, the reverse auction schemes really are looking like the best policy to drive up deployment of utility scale renewables. But the feed-in tariff policy has been really successful and is a really successful option for the small scale renewables behind the meter.
Thank you very much.
Much more, yeah, obviously it's much more simple policy that's easier to apply in that for distributed PV.
Okay, thank you. So we have one of our colleagues from Bhutan, Mr. Bhaskar. I'd like to ask question from you. Yes, please.
Hello, Dr. Anna. My question is related to renewable certificate. Is it binding on the part of the customer to buy this certificate? And if it is binding, what is the minimum percentage that they have to buy renewable certificate? And the second question is, to adjust renewable energy, you must be balancing it from other generating sources like coal, gas, etc. How do you address this and how are they compensated? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to go to the diagram that I have here for how the renewable energy certificate scheme works. So maybe I have a better diagram actually. Maybe this one is more simple. So here we have the power stations, the renewable energy power stations. They generate the certificates, and the liable entities are actually the retailers, and they need to purchase the certificates. So the power stations produce the certificates, and there's a regulator that the clean energy regulator that manages the REC registry, and the liable entities need to purchase those certificates, and the percentage, they need to have a certain percentage, a certain number of certificates equal to the target in each year. So the target changes in every year, so ramping up to our ultimate target, which is actually 33,000 gigawatt hours, which is the target. And so there's a ramping up from year to year, and each year they have to have enough certificates to meet that requirement. Does that make, yeah, hoping that kind of makes sense. The other certificate might be a little bit better. What was the second part of the question?
The second part is, to adjust renewable energy that you are generating, you must be balancing it from the other generating sources like coal, gas, etc. That means you have to back down those generations when RE is producing too much. So how do you address this, and how are they compensated?
Yes, so in Australia we have an electricity market where the generators all place bids to generate electricity in every 5 minutes, the market operator then takes those bids and dispatches the lowest cost generators to meet the demand in each 5-minute period. And so when there's renewable energy available, then that is bidding in a very low cost, and particularly because of the value of the renewable energy certificates, sometimes even negative cost, because of the very low operating costs of the wind and solar. So they're dispatched, and the other so when they're operating, as long as there's no network constraints, they're always dispatched, and then the other generators get dispatched on top of that according to their prices. And at times when there's not much renewable energy available, then the price goes up. And if there is a need to ramp up very quickly, then some of the generators in the market that are more flexible are able to bid to be dispatched in those periods, and that's when we have the more expensive, more flexible gas generation coming into the market during those times.
Thank you very much, Anna. So what I understand is that normally this Australia for backup of our RE, they normally use these gas-based generators through this open market, right?
Yeah. So coal and gas with providing flexibility. And then we actually do also have another set of ancillary services markets, including markets to provide flexibility over shorter time periods within 5 minutes. And so there's another there's another auction process where generators that can provide this flexibility can bid into those frequency control ancillary services markets. And so typically the participants in those markets are also the more flexible generators like these gas generators, and we've just started to more recently see this flexibility being provided by batteries. We've had a utility scale battery, which Adrian might mention, and also demand response bidding into these frequency control markets as well.
Thank you very much, Anna. It was wonderful listening to you, responding to. I even have still got like 3 to 4 questions, so I will try to address them at the knowledge sharing session with you if you are available. Otherwise, Michael, or maybe then we can send you via email if those questions are left behind. So my apologies to the participants if their questions remain unanswered. We will definitely try to address them by the end of in our knowledge sharing session or afterwards on the email. So thank you very much, Anna, for your very good presentation and very interesting kind of a question answer session. And we would now move on towards our next presenter. Let me see if Michael is there.
Yes, can you hear me okay, Asan?
Yes, perfect, fine.
Okay, so a very big thank you to Anna for her very comprehensive presentation. So we will now move to the final presentation, which is to hear from Dr. Adrian Pano. He's going to talk about the role of the Australian states in accelerating solar PV uptake. So just to tell you a little bit about Adrian, he's the director of Deakin Energy at Deakin University. He's a senior executive and advisor across the resources, agriculture, manufacturing, and renewable energy fields. He's worked in government, the private sector, and in research. So right now with his role at Deakin, he's providing leadership for Deakin University as the preferred partner for industry and government in the delivery of innovative solutions to the sustainable energy supply challenges. The initiative that he heads, it brings together capabilities from across Deakin University in a network that addresses industry and government identified issues in areas such as microgrids, energy generation, distribution, storage, energy demand management, and the things that go along with that, such as economic policy and social and regulatory frameworks. So he does have hands-on practical responsibilities with his role, because right now he's looking after the delivery of a 7.25 megawatt solar and storage microgrid at the campus near Melbourne. And through this process, he's going to address research, energy costs, and sustainability objectives. So Adrian, by way of his background, he has a Bachelor of Applied Science in Biochemistry and Applied Chemistry and a doctorate in Industrial Biotechnology, along with graduate qualifications in Business Administration. He's also a graduate member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. So very patiently, Adrian has been sitting and listening to our backwards and forwards and the questions and answers. So now over to you, Adrian. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your presentation.
Adrian, probably you have self-muted yourself. Can you unmute yourself?
Is that working now?
Yes, perfectly fine. It's audible and your
Very
presentation
good.
is also.
All right, so let me, so my screen is available now, hopefully?
Yes, we can see it, sir. You can go ahead, please.
Okay, excellent. All right. Now, so thank you. I've listened to the presentations, and I think many of the topics that I was going to cover are actually touched upon, but I will give perhaps a different slant to what has been driving many of the initiatives, particularly that Anna spoke about, and with states responding in their own way.
I think we have lost.
The striking similarity on the challenges that we face in integration of high levels of variable generation, of dealing with different human expectations about where energy comes from and how much it costs and how people will utilize it, are strikingly similar. So I hope that the topics that we've covered tonight and that I'll cover actually might surprise you how directly they apply to a very broad range of
Adrian, might if I interrupt, your voice is not coming up. It's not audible. Your presentation is clear. We can see it, but we cannot hear you properly.
It's showing up as being very loud for me.
Now it's okay, but previously there was a lag of like 5 to 6 seconds. Please go ahead.
Okay. So the drivers, as far as I'll cover, there are some legal international commitments, but the response to climate change, to personal costs of electricity, both at the residential and the commercial level, are extreme, and ultimately also taking control of energy consumption are key factors. We've covered off the highest level, and
I think probably Adrian is having some issue with his audios. Uh, in the meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, I would repeat again, if you have any questions, you can type your questions or click on the raised hand option into the attendees pane. We will send your questions to the presenters and we can address them into the question answer session, or else we can also address them later on via email to the participants and back to you. So let's hope Adrian is back. Adrian, can you hear us?
I can hear you very clearly.
I don't know, but your voice seems, your audio seems to drop after every 4 or 5 seconds. We lost you like for complete 10, 12 seconds now. So could you just
Yeah.
restart this slide again, please?
Yes. I apologize. I don't know what's going on there. But just that slide is saying that Australia has an ambition to reduce its, or a commitment under the Paris Agreement to reduce its emissions, but on an economy-wide level. So it's not just electricity. However, because, as Anna said, our electricity generation fleet is largely driven by black and let's see if that does that help. I've changed microphone, so the ability to influence our overall emissions is influenced most greatly by changing our electricity generation mix, because we are so driven at the moment by black and brown coal generation. So electricity has been a particular focus point. I will move on quite quickly, and some of these slides Anna has already used because someone has prepared them on our behalf, which is wonderful of them. The importance of this slide is not so much that we've achieved different things in different states. It's that the different policies and the different drivers across a single nation makes investment very, very uncertain. If you are a solar developer and you're looking at projects in Australia from overseas, what you really are looking at is a collection of not a single approach to policy, but one that is spread across seven states, or 6 states and 2 territories. And each one of them has a different approach to policy, and even if the policies like a feed-in tariff sound similar, the detail may be quite different, where some have been gross feed-in tariffs, others have been net feed-in tariffs. And the ultimate result, and particularly at a national level, if there is uncertainty at a national level on policy, what we've seen, and Anna's slide quite clearly demonstrated the peaks and the troughs of investment as investors wait to understand what their certainty is or what the investment environment is. And at the same time, other nations internationally are pursuing very similar goals. So an international investor has many options as to where they'll go, and that has been a critical influence for how our projects have been developed. That being said, there has obviously been a very significant driver for government to act, and it's very personally, I sometimes think, is the message that we're trying to put across, is it something that only a very small number of people care about? And this slide and the logo may or may not be familiar to Michael as one of the organisations he previously worked with, Sustainability Victoria, is a Victorian state government group agency, and this survey was conducted last year. What it demonstrates is that there is a much larger proportion of certainly the Victorian population that both are concerned about climate change, but also believe that unusual weather events are due to climate change, and that the impact on fires and of their well-being is in fact driven and very closely connected to climate change. The response then from government to the voting public, to the people who will elect the politicians, has been to respond with a whole range of policies. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that, and this was a topic for discussion even in India last week, that the population, the individuals within a community, will often be the drivers of that change rather than governments being in control and driving it. And it's in fact a situation where governments need to keep up with what the population is doing. Also, there's a question about electric vehicles, and Anna mentioned vehicle to grid. This is where the car battery is being used as a storage device on grid. Tesla has banned that practice in software because they're finding that the battery is being discharged in a way that they had never expected, and it's certainly not being discharged in proportion to the distance that the car has driven. So the consumers have seen a technological opportunity and a commercial opportunity, but the manufacturers and potentially the grid operators aren't prepared for that change yet. So it's always a tension between the regulators, the policymakers, and the community being quite innovative. The key driver, and again, it was a question that was asked about costs. The key driver for individuals to act on their energy consumption by becoming more efficient, but also by installing rooftop solar, has been cost. And the cost that we're seeing very much is the cost, and this is the Victorian example. So the change in our residential electricity pricing from 2007 up to 2017, so a 10-year period. Our annual residential bill averaged at about $1,177 a year. In the space of 10 years, that has now gone to $1,750, so a very substantial increase. From that chart, you'll see that the network costs, the poles and wires, have been the largest single cause for that increase in cost. And they now make up, as an individual component, the largest individual component. They did, and they now have continued to make up the largest individual component. The cost of generation has been nowhere near what some of the climate skeptics say about renewables as well. Over that time, our cost of generation has fallen, and also the cost of the green schemes, so the cost of the renewable energy target, the cost of the energy efficiency targets. These charges are nowhere, well, they're almost a quarter, slightly more than a quarter of what the network charge increase has been. And also they are less than the retail costs. So this is the cost after the organisations who sit between the electricity network and the final end user, that their marginal costs make up a significant proportion of the bill and have in fact gone up at a greater rate than the costs of both the generation and of the green schemes. So that enormous increase in cost and the energy use, and still is a small proportion of residential household expenditure, but it has moved by from being 2.5% to 3% a very significant increase in absolute value rather than just proportion. So it is being felt, and consumers are responding to that. They, this slide, I don't intend you to read the words, and I knew that Anna was going to cover it and has covered all of the feed-in tariff changes. I've used South Australia, one of our states, just to illustrate how many changes there have been over the last several years. And we're not talking over a period of 10 years. This is over a period of about 5, most of them. But going back to 2008, we had one feed-in tariff initially introduced. It then got reviewed in 2009-10. It was then changed in 2011. So the point of this slide is that there have been so many changes over a short period of time that investment is difficult. And if investment is difficult, the risk margin that the investor will build in to their pricing is significant. So the more certainty that governments can provide, and it's not saying that feed-in tariffs, for example, will never change. What I am saying, and is very important, is that the trajectory, the path that government is going to take to review, to change, to amend its schemes, if that can be made very clear, then investors can invest over a long period. But if it's uncertain, like the feed-in tariff regime at the national level, there was uncertainty whether it would even exist, let alone be changed, and that prevents rational investment. So I encourage all on this call, to the extent that you can influence your own lawmakers, certainty is really key to low prices. Despite that uncertainty, and Anna's chart was in megawatts, this chart is in gigawatt hours. So despite the uncertainty over a period of 5 years, this is 2012 to end of 2017, beginning of 2018, you can see that there has been a dramatic increase in our installed capacity. And obviously this is solar, and so it peaks in our summer, which is in January. And so we're getting an ever-increasing peak across all jurisdictions in Australia. And so we've gone from a peak in 2012 of about 400 gigawatt hours to now over 1,000, over 1,000 gigawatt hours. And because most of this generation, almost all of it at residential scale, will be behind the meter, this is a reduction in the load that the grid overall experiences. And so if you think of PV, residential PV, as an energy efficiency measure, it simply means that the other generators that that historically have provided our energy are required to run less, because we are simply consuming less, because we're displacing it with our own generation. This graph here is one produced by Dylan McConnell at the University of Melbourne, and it illustrates that previous chart, I think, wonderfully well. What you're seeing here is the average demand by time, November, so summer, coming up to summer in South Australia. Over a period of 7 years, from 2011 down to 2018, the summer peak, and South Australia is not one of our most populated states, its consumption in the middle of the day went from just over 1,600 megawatts of demand down to 2018, it bottoms out at just over 1,000. So a reduction of over 500 megawatts, over a third of the consumption over a period of 7 years. And many of the questions previously have been how do networks, how do distributors cope with that change? Well, the answer is that they're struggling to do that. Technology is assisting enormously, but they are coping, and some has required new investment, others has required less investment and closing down of some power stations. Now, a peak that we're seeing at midnight here, and I'm hoping that my mouse is showing it, but at midnight there is a peak, and if we were live in this discussion, I would be asking the audience what that peak represents. But given the situation, that is an electric hot water peak. In South Australia, historically, electric hot water storage hot water units were timed as a controlled load to operate at midnight in order to allow the coal-fired generator to have enough load at night to keep operating. Now, the coal-fired generator has closed. South Australia is now gas, wind and solar, and a very strong, or a medium strength interconnector to Victoria. But the question now arises, with the reduced demand in the middle of the day, does this peak actually need to still happen? Why would electric hot water not run and have a smart inverter and smart control system that would enable it to run during the day? And that is a question that is obviously at the front of mind for network planners and for retailers, because as this peak drops, and you can see that it's now a similar size peak to the one that occurs at 3 o'clock in the morning, you could retime controlled loads to make use of that. Now, that's South Australia. I'll just touch on Queensland, one of our northern states that has a very high penetration of solar, still has a large amount of coal. This graph I've included because it obviously shows some movement over that time, but it's not really clear that solar has had much of an impact. And that is largely because the load overall has gone up, and the throwaway line, and Anna has touched on it, is cheap Chinese air conditioners. And I don't mean that in a derogatory term, it's that air conditioners used to be a very expensive form of cooling. Not many people had them. Houses were designed to stay cool, and as a population, we were happy enough to have a bit more warmth in the summer. Because the price of air conditioning units has fallen so dramatically, much more air conditioning is now installed, and houses have become designed for that. So if we normalize the load, we get our graph back. So here, rather than having a reduction, an increase in load hiding the overall graph, normalize the load for a 3 a.m. load. You again see, even in Queensland, completely different population and source of generation, which is still black coal driven. Exactly the same issue arises. We have a reduction in the afternoon peak. It's earlier in the day in Queensland. They are further north, and we're seeing a different profile. But it's very clear, and again, an enormous reduction over a short period of time. This is the most current installed capacity across different states. The small-scale installations, the report from October to December 2018. The number of rooftop installations is enormous. It is in Queensland in that quarter, over 16,000, New South Wales, same number, in Victoria, almost 20,000 systems were installed in that period. So we're not seeing a decrease in number, we're seeing an acceleration, and it brings into the question why that's happening. Now, this next slide, these suburban names, these areas in each of the states and territories
obviously won't mean a great deal to most of the audience. I've included them so I can say, mention the dot points on the right. These suburbs are not the traditional high net worth suburbs. They are growth areas where there is a lot of housing construction. These are, in some cases, old suburbs that are being renewed. They are suburbs where many of the residents have high mortgages. They owe money to the bank for their house. And they have also, particularly in Victoria, some of these suburbs have had very high levels of marketing by solar installers. And so those 5 dot points have really driven the installation of solar hot water, but particularly PV. So cost of living, the installation has now become so inexpensive that we say it can be put on the credit card. So you can have that installation done and not significantly change your household expenditure. And it's and there's also a greater awareness and about community, and some of the community energy projects, the 5th dot point there, are driving a great uptake. So my question here is that, is this actually a policy-driven uptake, or is it simply a cost of living result where PV is just becoming the norm? And so we have perhaps in some areas of Australia got to a point where policy is no longer the key driver. It is indeed cost and a willingness to participate in that climate debate. Anna had the slide up, and I want to put it up in a slightly different context. So this slide represents the national electricity market, which is the whole east coast of Australia. We don't have it interconnected to the western side of the country, but the NEM makes up the vast majority of traded electricity. The amount of electricity traded is about $16.5 billion a year, 52 gigawatts total generation roughly, and it is a gross pool market. So we have a disconnection between carriage and content. So it is a financial market, but obviously the electrons still move as well, but they are quite disconnected in terms of markets. Each of the state regions was traditionally a separate region technically, and it's only been over the last several decades that they have had interconnections. And this results in different prices in each of the regions. The study that the Australian Energy Market Operator did of how do you integrate highly variable generation into a traditional grid demonstrated that the most cost-effective way of doing it is by building targeted networks. It's because generation will tend to occur, given it's renewable in its form, it will tend to occur where the resources are best rather than where the network either exists or the population exists. You simply can't tell a wind farm to be built in the middle of Sydney or Melbourne because that's where the load is. You can't do that because that's where the wind isn't. And so you do need to build them where the resource is. And therefore, from AEMO's estimates, the most cost-effective mechanism to aid that development is to build new transmission lines. And it's probably a relevant topic for certainly countries like India, where the ambitions for solar and wind, but solar in particular, are quite heroic. If you don't have the transmission in place, most of those assets will be stranded and of very little investor value. I'll now touch on last few slides around particularly the Victorian state government programs that have come out in the last couple of months. We had a state election in November last year, and there were a number of programs that were initiated and promoted, and the government was successful, and so these programs are now in place. The first one is solar homes, and that's what the program is called. So this is, if you think back to my original points, why are we seeing these dramatic changes? I think that these are quotes from the actual policy that the government has put in place. Solar Homes package is about giving Victorians greater control over their household bills. So it's the combination of control and bills. The policy itself is a 50% rebate on the cost of a 4 kilowatt PV system. So it's current, we're at about $1,000 a kilowatt, dollar a watt, fully installed in Australia. So the government will pay half of that, and also for solar hot water, it will provide up to $1,000 rebate. The benefits and the rationale for this policy is that, again, households will be able to save money. About $890 a year off that bill, if you remember, is averaging at about $1,700, so almost half the bill. The solar hot water, again, a saving of between $160 and $400. With a system being relatively inexpensive in Australian terms, at 4 kilowatts, there is a legitimate question to ask whether government needs to subsidise a system going forward. Is it sufficiently inexpensive and the returns are sufficient that consumers will install themselves? And that remains an open question, and it's one that I think is a balance between politics and commercial reality that will be different in every jurisdiction. Every country will have a different balance, but it ultimately is that balance that comes into play. The second scheme that was rolled out is one that has caused enormous political pain in Australia. In some areas, there is a very high proportion of rental accommodation, so people not owning their own homes, but in fact renting them, either because they have a financial situation where that is where they are, or alternatively they choose to rent. So a program was put in place in Victoria that is finding a way to subsidise renters to have solar panels put on properties where that's possible to do. So this is if you're renting a house, then you are subsidised a similar amount, $2,000. The landlord is provided with an interest-free loan, and the renters pay the equivalent of that $4,000 system of $250 a year for 4 years. Again, an interest-free loan. So it gives you equivalency of if you owned your own house. Now, obviously, you can't offset that electricity, or the landlord doesn't see that electricity offset their bills because the renter pays the bill, but they would get a return through an increase in the property value, because having solar on the roof is considered to be an asset when houses are sold. The third part of the solar programs that was rolled out last year by the government is again one that Anna has touched on, and it is at the large scale. So this is the Victorian Renewable Energy Auction Scheme, and again, the headline: why was the government doing this? It was being done for jobs, energy security and reliability, and climate. Victoria is very much driven by lignite, by brown coal. So this was a way of government intervening in the market. We had one of our large generators close. The government intervened in the market through a reverse auction. It brought forward far greater number of bids into that auction than they expected, but these are the 6 projects that were successful. 3 wind farms and 3 solar plants. I can confirm so Deakin is one of the requirements for participation in that scheme was that there was both local content and both local research. And so Deakin is the research partner for 2 of the wind farms, one in an area of carbon fibre development, and in another one it's on remote monitoring, on drones, on UAVs, community engagement around virtual reality of how do you model those wind farms. So I can confirm that the prices out of that auction were between $54 and $58 per megawatt hour, effectively unsubsidised, so without certificates. And surprisingly, solar was very similar to wind, whereas only a couple of years ago solar was significantly higher in cost than wind. Contract for difference, it provided investment certainty, and the benefits of this unsubsidised low rate estimated by government is $30 a year for households and $2,500 in reduction of electricity bills for businesses, and $140,000 a year reduction for large consumers of electricity, all because these projects will depress wholesale electricity prices. The construction of those projects hasn't been without challenges for the network, particularly the solar projects, because that part of the state, even though it has a 220 kilovolt grid through it, there is no load in that part of the state, or minimal load in that part of the state. And so that network is needing to be strengthened so that the solar plants aren't constrained off. So that was the main part of the presentation about the policy for PV. In our discussion yesterday with Hassan and Michael, it was suggested that there would be a significant amount of interest in battery storage. So I've put together a couple of slides here about the Hornsdale Power Reserve. So this is the lithium-ion 100 megawatt facility that entered the market last year in 2018. It's owned by a company called Neoen, who also own the 300 megawatt Hornsdale wind farm. The battery was supplied by Tesla. It, I think, is still the largest in the world as a single facility. So 100 megawatt capacity with an energy storage capacity of 129 megawatts. One of the one of the elements that made it cost effective was that it is sharing a high voltage connection with the wind farm, and it's a challenge for renewable projects. As they get cheaper, the balance of system and particularly the network connection is a very significant cost. So by sharing it, it has been able to reduce its overall cost. The way that the commercial arrangements for that battery are written is that 70 megawatts of that 100 is designated for system security, and these were contracted by the South Australian state government. After the collapse of the transmission line through the wind event, there was great nervousness from the state government that the lights would go out. and so they entered into this contract. 30 megawatts of the capacity and all bar 10 of the megawatt hours of storage is available to Neoen for market participation. And so this is so that 70 megawatts is a guaranteed return, and the 30 megawatts, they effectively play the market and get whatever value they can. Over the last year, in fact, a day before the battery was officially announced, the interconnector between South Australia and Victoria failed, and so the battery was asked to respond to a frequency event. Now, the frequency controlled ancillary services market is a small market in Australia, and it has been traditionally met by gas turbines, either open cycle or steam, as they've been the fastest able to respond. This is a report done by Oricon of the performance of the battery over the last year. So the Haywood interconnector, Haywood is the interconnection point between the states of Victoria and South Australia, and it tripped, so lost 200 megawatts instantaneously. The frequency started to fall, and the bottom scale is seconds, so well within 5 seconds, in fact within probably around 1, the Hornsdale battery, so HPR, Hornsdale power response, activated. It met the drop in the frequency, and so the green line on that chart shows how the frequency, yes, it dropped from 50, but it remained within the permissible zone and returned back to acceptable levels within 30 seconds, and Hornsdale dispatched 50 megawatts. The modelling that Oricon did, if the battery wasn't in the system, then the frequency would have dropped below 49 hertz, down to 48.71. So it would have been a very significant event on the network. So the battery, even before it was fully commissioned, was already responding. Obviously, the installers and operators of the battery will need to make money, and this is again looking at the market value of the Hornsdale Power Reserve from when it was installed in 2017 to end of November last year. Over that period, the battery or the facility generated about $24 million of revenue. And it came from 3 areas. One was pure energy, so its cost of the revenue that it generated by selling energy into the grid, 6.2 million. It cost 3.3 million to charge it, so it consumed 3.3 million, and therefore the net value was $2.9 million. Contingency, this is where it acted as the backup. If wind was suddenly to drop, or as has happened over 100 times over the last year, a coal-fired generator, because they are getting old, failed to start or tripped out, the battery was able to back that up, and so it has derived half of its 24 million from contingency payments. And finally, the regulatory payment. So this is where it has controlled frequency. As I said, a very small market, but because of its ability to intervene, it has generated about $4 million of revenue. So it for a total cost of just over $90 million, over 1 year, it has generated a quarter of that. And so it's likely to be quite a profitable exercise. I'll finish off with a couple of slides. I realise we're running well over time. this is what frequency control and regulation looks like at the moment. So a large conventional steam turbine over a period of an hour. The green line, the dark green line, is the variations in the network, and the light green line is the ability of that steam turbine to respond to those changes. So fairly good response, but not exact. But it has been sufficient to keep the network stable because of the interconnected nature of the national grid. However, if we look at what the battery did over in exactly the same period over the space of 1 hour, you can see here that the power command, so this is the signals from the grid saying I need megawatts dispatched in order to keep the grid stable. The battery mirrored that requirement almost perfectly over the space of the hour. So compared to the two graphs where you had a fairly good response to a precise response, the difference is dramatic. The impact of that precision, though, is not valued in our market at the moment. And it is an area of intense policy development and technical development as we move from a half-hour settlement for cost down to a 5-minute settlement in the main market. But even in the frequency-controlled market, there hasn't been a premium paid for extremely fast response. And yet technology has enabled that. So I put these slides up as an image of reality, but also to encourage you to think about what that might mean in your own jurisdictions and how you might make use of that. I'll finish off with, Michael mentioned that I have responsibility for a project on our own campus. So this is a campus. So this project is really an integration of many of the issues that I've spoken about cost. The electricity cost for the university is about $10 million a year. And it is now significant enough that it's impacting on our ability to deliver education. So but this project is enabled because this particular campus, and we have 4 in Melbourne, has 330 hectares behind the electricity meter. So we have the land, but we also have consumption. So on this campus, we have 100 tonnes per year carbon fibre plant. We have a large manufacturing facility. We have a hospital. We have our medical faculty. So we have a consumption on campus of 21 gigawatt hours a year. We're building 7 megawatts of ground mount solar, megawatt size central battery, distribute another quarter of a kilowatt or more of, a quarter of a megawatt or more of distributed solar and smaller batteries across the campus with a visualization center. And so the whole project is about $20 million Australian. Our payback, we feel, will be within 10 years. It's longer than a traditional commercial project because it is very open and available for research, therefore not optimized for outcome. But its main value will be to control our peak demand, our demand charge, which is equivalent to a peak, or similar, is a way of networks responding to peak, and then even out our load across the day. So it's a project that is also being driven by costs. Our sustainability ambitions are to be carbon neutral by 2030, and this will immediately cut our emissions by half. So I will finish at that point, but just to emphasise that consumer costs, jobs, climate commitments are all things that drive a lot of policy development, and often they are the drivers of government towards policy development, not necessarily government being the drivers. And particularly in the storage space, Deakin has a very large group called Battery Hub, has about 60 researchers in electromaterials and batteries who are developing
current and next generation batteries. So we have much to learn about how these new technologies will impact our grid, it would be very efficient to be able to learn off each other. And so having this collaboration, and thank you to Hassan and Michael for creating the opportunity to have the discussion, because I think we genuinely can collaborate because these issues are not competitive. They are, and they'll be solved through that cooperation. And so very, very grateful for the opportunity to have this discussion, and also look forward to the discussion tonight and going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Adrian, for a very wonderful and informative presentation. I'm pretty sure all the participants must have enjoyed all the contents of your presentation. So it seems we have a lot of questions concerning this battery storage which you shared. So the first question is what is the mechanism for this disposal of these lithium-ion batteries, and what is the approximate life of those battery bank? The second question is what is the economics if you compare the battery bank versus the gas generators? I'm talking from the perspective of stabilizing the frequency if you have these gas generators comparable to the battery banks.
Okay. First of all, the life and the circular economy, that's a term that I don't know if is familiar to everybody. Circular economy is what we refer to in Australia, is to ensure that not only is it the recycling side, but it's also ensuring that your raw materials are produced ethically, that they are then there is a chain of custody throughout the life of the material. And so at the moment, and it's an area that our battery group is really applying its thinking to, is it's very difficult to understand the life of a battery. So, and I say that you can't look into a battery readily and say, well, this battery, because of its current chemistry, has only 20% of its life left. So they're looking at ways of how do you analyze a battery, obviously non-destructively, to understand that lifetime. So currently batteries are guaranteed for between 5 and 10 years, and that could be assumed to be a life. But in nearly all cases, and particularly in electric vehicles, the battery is considered to be end of life when it reaches 80% of its charging capacity. We're already seeing installations, I looked at one in University of California, San Diego, that BMW had put together using those end-of-life batteries in a second life environment. So yes, it might have a lifespan of, let's say, 5 years in a car, but it might have a lifespan of another 10 years if it's used in a stationary environment. So it's a bit of a roundabout answer to say we don't really know, and that's a significant risk. But if you assume 5 to 10 years, most of the chemicals in the battery could be recycled, and for the larger installations, and the same for PV installations, the larger installations are simpler in terms of recycling because there is generally a single operator or a single owner, and so you can gather back the materials and the panels and take them to recycling. And most of the, certainly for our own microgrid development, we are every one of the suppliers has guaranteed both this chain of custody, but also have shown how they're going to recycle. It is a problem though, because the technology, the rollout of technology is well in advance of the environmental systems for recycling. So certainly an area of research.
I've forgotten. Oh, yes. And so the other part of the question was the relative merits of batteries and gas. This is entirely an open question, and it comes down to these two charts, that one and that one. At the moment, the frequency control market in the NEM is only about $50 million, 50 million out of 16 billion, and gas has been the market that has met that. And then this other one around the contingency is a much bigger market, difficult to quantify, but again has been met with gas primarily. The South Australian example has already shown that the battery, because it was subsidised, has saved, and I'd need to look up the figures, but I think it was about $40 million for South Australian electricity consumers, because it has reduced prices. And it's reduced them because of the reduction in the amount of gas that has been used in that contingency segment. Gas in Australia, even though we produce more gas than we need, most of it is exported, and the liquefied natural gas market, the LNG market, has been far more lucrative than domestic gas. And so gas prices have gone up dramatically in Australia, and it's been difficult to get a long-term gas contract. So batteries, wind, solar, a key element of their ability to reduce electricity prices has been because of the reduction in the reliance on gas.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Really clarified it. So I have 2-3 more questions, but Adrian, I think we are very sorry, we are running out of time. So let me hand over to Michael for his wrap-up and conclusions. But I'll surely send the questions to you on email, maybe. So you may respond back to them, and then we can address them to the participant. But once again, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hassan. And I think we heard a lot of detail across those 3 presentations, but somehow the themes that they expressed fitted together very nicely, and hopefully gave all of the participants out there a much broader understanding of how Australia has grappled with this challenge. You know, we heard from Damien about the industry, how it's become very well organized to ensure that the quality is there, with the very excellent peak body, the Clean Energy Council, that looks after all of these industries and drives the accreditation program. You know, we heard a very detailed account of Anna of kind of the policy journey in Australia, and how the federal government policy has had to match up with the state government policy. And, you know, one very interesting slide she showed was the volume of PPAs taking off from the corporate entities, the fact that corporations are buying renewable energy directly. It's very encouraging picture. And then lastly from Adrian, you know, with this kind of message that we think of policy as kind of a top-down phenomenon, but often it's the concerns of local people on the ground about their local issues, of energy affordability, of climate change, of the things that affect them in their daily life, which are pushing upwards. So it's a local meeting the global issues. He also talked about how solar is having this incredible effect on electricity demand in different states with this duck curve, and how if that continues, there'll have to be a rethink of how we manage the grids and different types of generators. And lastly, that very interesting piece on batteries. We've all been reading about these batteries in Australia, and it looks like a lot of large renewable energy systems, when they go in, they're now automatically thinking of having a battery there, not just for sort of price arbitrage and playing the market, but also they can play a much broader role in the stability of the system. And, you know, batteries have been criticized by saying, well, look, it's very small in relation to the overall demand, but it's not really the size, it's more the speed, I think, that Adrian demonstrated, how quickly they can respond to preventing a wider system collapse. So it's a very exciting future, and it was really great that we could get some kind of an insight into what Australia is doing, And of course, it hasn't all been rosy. There's been some speed humps along the way. But I think through the questions, a lot of the participants have managed to tease out some of these examples and hopefully adapt them or try to translate them to their own different national contexts. So that's really all I wanted to say, to you, Hassan, and to all of the distinguished participants out there and the directors of the SAARC Energy Center. It was really nice to have the chance to work together with you, and I hope it's been a useful experience. So with that, perhaps I pass back across to you in Islamabad, Hassan, for the final word.
Thank you very much, Michael. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I may like to conclude our webinar. Thank you everyone for attending today's session of the webinar. We had listened to some excellent presentations delivered by our distinguished presenters from Australia. We are also grateful to Michael Williamson from UNSC for providing encourage with the experts between SAARC and Australian experts. And all the presentations will be available on SAARC Energy Center's website very shortly. We would love to hear from you any suggestions and comments for further improvement, plus any suggested topics of your interest on to arrange similar future webinars. We would definitely gladly do that. With me signing out, thank you again for joining us today and looking forward to see you next time. Bye-bye.